Hello learners, welcome back to the course on learning and development in organization. Today we start a new module which talks about knowledge, a module which talks about knowledge management, how effectively an organization can manage the incoming knowledge and how effectively it can disseminate to the entire set of organization employee pool. I am Dr. Cyril Issac. I am an assistant professor at the School of Business, Indian Institute of Technology, Guwahati. Now, when you look into knowledge management, it has different dimensions. It has been studied from system point of view. It has studied from an organic point of view, with respect to behavioral point of view. So, there are different dimensions of knowledge management, approaches. So, specifically, concern to learning and development, I would be more concentrating on what knowledge management is, what are the different components, and specifically how organization typically manages knowledge within and how it caters to a learning and development environment within the organization. So let's start with today's theme. Your attitude, not your aptitude, will determine your altitude. So this you would have already heard, but when you look into learning and development specifically, let's take an example. You venture into a particular organization right at a very nascent stage. Then you think that, okay, everything is done, everything is set. I don't have to update myself. I don't have to study anything. I don't have to learn anything more. Then you're dead. Basically, you're dead because your growth gets stunned there. So this is what typically this quote underlines. Your attitude, not your aptitude, will determine your altitude. And the entire discussion in this particular session will revolve around this wonderful quote. So let's look into the possible L&D interventions that the organization can have. When you're looking into learning and development, there are a lot of possibilities an organization can bring in. But many a time we feel or we understand that the organizations fail to understand L&D as a critical vertical. They just maybe brush aside it as another vertical, or sometimes might not include it even as a different vertical. Rather, they'll try to put it and club it with HR main. But that's not the case. L&D has potentials, and the organizations which have understood this will go for L&D interventions. Let's understand what are the typical aspects related to L&D interventions. When you're talking about L&D interventions per se, they should be purposeful, they should be planned activities that aim to close skill gaps and develop capabilities. So they range from formal training activities or training programs to coaching relationships, from digital learning platforms to structured on-the-job experiences. So these interventions are typically based on identified needs and designed with the specific learning outcomes in mind. When you are looking into the success of L&D interventions, specifically the on-the-job experiences should be enhanced. That should be the core purpose with respect to L&D interventions. When you are looking into the key characteristics of L&D interventions, they include alignment with business objectives and strategy. You look into the typical aspects of learning and development interventions. It should have the strategic intent. It should have customization to address the specific skill gaps. It should be purposeful in design based on learning science. So it should have purposeful design based on the learning science, and it should be measurable. There should be measurable outcomes that demonstrates the impact. And finally, there should be integration with the work process and work systems altogether. So when you are looking into effective interventions, you have to always understand that your organization is looking into these key characteristics typically. Now let's look into some of the advantages of L&D intervention specifically. For employees, you see that it is all about enhanced skills and capabilities that improve performance. Let's understand it typically for employees and for organizations specifically. As I mentioned, for employees, it is all about enhancing the skills and capabilities. It is all about increased confidence and job satisfaction. It's all about clear pathways for career development and growth. And you also look into greater engagement and sense of organizational investment. Ladies and gentlemen, please note, organizational investment incurs a lot of cost, time, cost, labor, a lot of things goes into it. So whether your employees give the return, whether the employees are okay, employees are good with respect to what you're investing on them, that is what makes it critical. Improved adaptability to changing work requirements also should be another critical aspect. When you look into organizations specifically, you will have increased productivity and operational efficiency as one of the significant advantages. You will also look into higher quality as one of the advantages, higher quality outputs, and you will have cases of minimum errors or reduced errors. You will have enhanced innovation and problem solving capability as part of an emerging advantages with respect to an organizational perspective. You will also have improved retention of top talent. People will feel that this is an organization, this is the organization where I have to work. Lot of possibilities, lot of work environment is very conducive. People are helpful, you do not have any stress. All these aspects will increase to improve retention of top talent. Particularly, you look into a situation where learning and development interventions actually enhances these aspects specifically. Then you have stronger leadership pipeline and succession planning as yet another advantage of the learning and development intervention specific to organization. And finally, greater organizational flexibility and adaptability. I'm just skimming through this because these are self-explanatory aspects, but you should know, for individual, for organizations, learning and development interventions has certain critical advantages, and these are some of them. Now let's look into organizational impact of these L&D interventions. Well-designed L&D interventions, no doubt, create significant positive impacts across multiple dimensions. You look into performance impact, I can certainly say that directly it improves the individual and team performance through enhanced capabilities and knowledge. This might manifest as faster work completion, as maybe higher quality outputs, or as we have discussed just before, few errors or minimum errors, or more innovative solutions. Another impact would be the cultural impact. You look into fostering a learning culture where continuous development is valued and expected. Organizations with strong learning cultures typically demonstrate greater resilience, innovation, and employee satisfaction. Then you have strategic impact, looking into building the capabilities that is needed for future success and competitive advantage. So strategic L&D interventions prepare the organization for upcoming challenges and opportunities by developing critical skills before they are urgently required or needed. Then you have the financial impact. You talk about the financial impact while requiring upfront investment. Please note, effective L&D interventions deliver a return through improved performance, through reduced turnover costs, and enhanced ability to meet business objectives. So organizations with mature L&D functions typically outperform their competitors financially. And if you look into the other significant impact, it is the adaptability impact. This is interesting because enhancing an organization's ability to respond to change through systematic development of both technical and adaptability skills. So L&D interventions help organizations navigate industry disruptions and evolving market conditions. So when properly aligned with organizational needs and thoughtfully implemented, L&D interventions transform from a cost center to a strategic advantage that drives sustainable business success. So let's look into the L&D intervention, specifically implementation challenges. The first and the most important aspect here is the time constraint. Please note, time constraint is a critical aspect for most of the intervention programs that an organization come up with, and needless to say here, L&D intervention has the same fate. So basically you look into the time constraint, the manifestation could be employees report being too busy for learning activities. Managers, hesitate to release staff for training. Development gets deprioritized, if I can use the word, in favor of immediate deliverables. So these are some of the critical aspects that comes in when you look into it as time constraint. How it is manifested, that's what is interesting. The impact is reduced participation rate. It will bring rushed learning experiences. It will elicit high dropout rates for longer programs and inconsistent application of new skills. So if we tend to understand this or read this more critically, you will get an idea that the underlying causes for this time constraint are organizational cultures that typically value immediate output over long-term capability building. Insufficient staffing levels could be another aspect which can create constant time pressure. Sometimes you look into poor planning that doesn't account for learning time in project schedules, and even at times perception of learning as separate from the real work, that also could bring in as a critical aspect or could come out as an underlying cause. You look into other significant implementation challenges, I will put second order as budget limitations. So you look into budget limitations, how it gets manifested. You may see that there is always a say in the organization that there is insufficient funding for comprehensive L&D programs, or sometimes the focus is on minimizing cost rather than maximizing the impact. Or sometimes you also see first area to face cuts during financial constraints is always L&D intervention. So these are some of the manifestations within the organization, and if you are going to cross-check the impact, please note over-reliance on low-cost solutions, regardless of the effectiveness, inconsistent learning experience across the organization, inability to leverage modern technologies or approaches are typically the impact. Let's understand, as in case of the time constraint, what are the underlying causes for budget limitations. I can always come up with different reasons. Viewing L&D as a cost center rather than investment in organization capability. Difficulty in demonstrating clear ROI, return on investment, can be a critical aspect for learning initiatives. Sometimes competing priorities for limited organizational resources would be there. People might be fighting for the available resources. So L&D would get the backseat because of that. Sometimes short-term financial focus versus long-term capability building might be the question. So these are some of the possible underlying causes, ladies and gentlemen. Now let's look into the resistance to change as another significant implementation challenge. How it is manifested? You look into skepticism about new approaches that are existing in the organization. You see reluctance to adopt new skills or processes. Statements like, we have always done it this way. Many people will generally tell, oh, this is what we do. This is how we have been doing for years. This is how we have been doing for the last decade. So all these statements typically show the resistance to change, passive participation without actual real engagement. Now, what's the impact? Limited application of new knowledge, regression to familiar methods under pressure, and I can also think of undermining of learning initiatives through informal influence. They don't want it that their face or their name be directly involved or coming to limelight as a person who curtailed or become a barrier for limiting or stopping the L&D intervention. So sometimes there might be informal influences. These are all situations which you see in your organization. So you can very well react to it, understand it and comprehend it. Now, As in case of the previous factors, let's understand what are the underlying causes for this resistance to change. Many a time, I would say the fear of incompetence. Fear of incompetence is always a problem. Past negative experiences with ineffective training, or the fear of incompetence during the transition to new methods. Sometimes insufficient explanation of, let's say, the why. Now, many a time the organization or the higher management is not capable to give an answer to the why. The why questions that every employee has, the questions that every worker in the organization has. Sometimes organization cultures that punish mistakes during the learning period, they may act as a deterrent. Sometimes lack of visible commitment from leadership or peer influencers can also be an underlying cause towards resistance to change. And finally, we look into transfer of learning. You know how it is manifested? You see initial enthusiasm followed by reversion to previous practices, inability to apply concepts in real work situations, and if I can say, there will be a disconnect between training environment and workplace realities. So how it is impacted? Wasted learning investment is the critical impact. There will be cynicism about the future learning initiatives that come up. There will be failure to achieve the desired performance improvements. What are the underlying causes? Let's look into that. As in case of the previous factors like time constraints, budget limitations, and resistance to change, there will be a gap between the controlled learning environments and the complex workplace context. So this gap is significant or can emerge significant in terms of the underlying causes for transfer of learning. Another significant cause might be the absence of Another significant underlying cause would be the absence of reinforcement mechanisms in daily life. Workplace systems or processes that conflict in new approach. Lack of reinforcement. Peer pressure to maintain status quo, or even lack of opportunities. They are all critical with respect to the transfer of learning costs. When you are looking into lack of opportunities, it is specific to lack of opportunities to practice new skills in low risk situations. So underlying causes we have rightly identified. Now, having seen the potential implementation challenges, having observed the typical possibilities, when we look into the L&D interventions and the implementation challenges, I would always say that when you look into learning and development, it's not all negative. You have to see why people are using it, because essentially of the benefit of learning and development, and that gives us or leads us to L&D interventions success strategy. You might have a lot of possibilities that are there with respect to L&D interventions, success stories, etc. A lot of aspects like executive sponsorship, manager involvement, learning in flow of work, and continuous reinforcement. We'll look into that in detail, but please do understand that why people go for L&D intervention is because people do understand the benefits, people do understand the possibilities that learning and development interventions open to an organization. So let's look into some of the success strategies in detail. We'll start with the executive sponsorship. Typically, if you ask me, when you are looking into executive ownership, there is a visible commitment. There's a visible commitment from senior leaders through communication and participation. There is always resource allocation that demonstrates that L&D is a priority for the organization. There will be always alignment of learning initiatives with strategic business objectives of the organization. There might be leaders modeling continuous learning behavior themselves. There might be integration of learning outcomes into organizational performance metrics. So what are the implementation tactics associated with executive sponsorship? If you ask me, I will say that regular learning updates in executive meetings. Senior leaders launching or concluding important programs, that is yet another implementation tactics. You look into executive participation as learners in development programs, there might be recognition of learning achievements in company-wide communications and explicit connection between the learning initiatives and the strategic goals. We also look into the manager involvement as yet another important success strategy. Managers actively supporting direct reports development before, during and after formal learning is vital. Integration of learning goals into performance management process is critical. Creation of, let's say, application opportunities for new skill is vital. Coaching and feedback to reinforce the development is also important. So accountability for team capability building or capacity building as part of the manager performance expectations is one of the underlying aspects when it comes to manager involvement. What are the implementation tactics? Many a time you see organizations that come up with pre-training briefings where managers discuss expectations and relevance, learning contracts between managers and employees outlining the support and application plans. There might be some post-training debrief sessions to discuss the implementation process altogether. Sometimes there are some manager toolkits with guidance on supporting specific learning initiatives. There might be some inclusion of team development effectiveness in manager evaluation also, that is pretty much possible. Now let's move into the third success strategy, which is learning in the flow of work. Look into the learning in the flow of work and deeply analyze it. You will see that integration of learning moments into regular work process rather than separate events is what signifies learning in the flow of work. Just-in-time resources available at the point of need. Learning designs that typically minimize the disruption in workflow. There are significant work projects structured to incorporate deliberate learning components. Technologies that reduce friction between working and learning. And when you look into the success strategy, that is learning in flow of work, you see that how it is implemented. Micro learning resources embedded in digital work environments is the way to go about it. There might be strategies that look into performance support tools accessible through regular work applications. There might be learning components built into existing meetings or workflows. There might be learning huddles, brief sessions focused on immediate application needs. There might be technology integrations that bring learning resources into collaboration platforms. You look into continuous reinforcement, you have systematic follow-up mechanisms rather than one-on-one learning events. There might be multiple touch points, to revisit and extend learning. There might be some social support structures maintaining focus on new behaviors. These are some of the possible key components associated with continuous reinforcement. You can also see there might be some recognition systems that reward application and improvement. Some data-informed approaches to identify reinforcement needs. And if you ask me the implementation tactics, you'll see that there are spaced learning designs with content delivered over time rather than all at once. Digital nudges and reminders about key concepts at appropriate intervals. Peer learning groups meeting regularly to discuss application challenges. Practice sessions scheduled weeks after initial learning. There might be application challenges where typically the learners compete to apply new skills. There might be recognition programs highlighting successful implementation stories. So these are some of the possible implementation tactics associated with continuous reinforcement. Now let's look into the integration of the challenges and their solutions. Let's go one by one. The most effective implementation approaches you see for time constraints specifically would be learning in the flow of work, which reduces perceived time impact. You look into executive sponsorship that establishes learning as a legitimate use of time. There might be manager involvement that ensures time is protected for development. When it comes to budget limitations, you see that there is executive sponsorship that ensures appropriate resource allocation. Learning in the flow of work often requires a less investment for traditional approaches. There might be continuous reinforcement that extends the impact of initial investment. So you see, these are some of the possible aspects when it comes to integration of challenges and solutions. Now, when you look into the resistance to change factor, you see that manager involvement creates local accountability and support. There might be some case of executive sponsorship, as in the previous case, which demonstrates organizational commitment, and with respect to continuous reinforcement, it provides support through the change curve. The learning curve might be quite less steeper in this particular case. You also look into, for transfer of learning, you see that learning in the flow of work specifically minimizes the gap between learning and application. So manager involvement creates accountability and application opportunities. Continuous reinforcement, please note, ladies and gentlemen, maintains focus beyond the initial learning event. So organizations that systematically addresses these implementation challenges significantly increase the return on their L&D investments and build more sustainable capability development systems. Now, let's look into some of the practical aspects, some of the things that are going on in the world of practice specific to companies and the notable L&D interventions. The moment you talk about learning and development interventions, I have to recall our past discussions in Google. With respect to Google, we had spent some time. I'm going to give you a different perspective here with respect to the actual L&D intervention. There is a 20% time intervention which allows employees to spend 20% of their work time on projects of personal interest. In the previous session, we have touched upon it. But when you are looking into this 20% time, it might be for typically fostering innovation. So when you're talking about it for their personal interest, it is typically fostering innovation, typically fostering the skills or skill development. So this is yet another important aspect when you talk about the Google's 20% time perspective. Then there is this G2G, Googler to Googler, a peer-to-peer learning framework. A peer-to-peer learning framework, a learning network where employees teach courses to colleagues specifically. Then you have this Career Guru program specifically, which connects employees with internal mentors. Internal mentors for career guidance. Now let's look into another organization, typically Airbnb. You look into Airbnb, needless to explain what it does, but more than that, when you look into the L&D interventions, what has become the most buzzword, what has become the most hot and critical topic is the fireside chat. You look into regular sessions with leaders and experts from within and outside the company. There is a program of World of Belonging where immersive training happens. Immersive training happens for hosts and employees focused on inclusion. Then there is this Data University. I think many of you might not be aware about it. It's a program to increase the data literacy across all the departments. Then you look into another organization, which is IBM. IBM has a typical aspect called a skills build. It's a AI powered platform, a learning platform that recommends skills based on career goals. There is a digital badge program where credentials for verified skills that employees can display externally. And there is a tech re-entry program, which is typically an initiative to help professionals return to work after career break. So when you are looking into organizations and their typical needs, you have to understand that L&D intervention takes a significant chunk of the resources. So many a time organizations restrict themselves or pull back themselves to actually give that required resources. So this curtails the learning and development within an organization. So over this session, we have tried to understand what are the possible dimensions of L&D interventions, what are the typical prospects, the importance, the benefits, the advantages. We have also looked into the barriers. We have also looked into the negative aspects which actually prevent organizations from getting into the groove of learning and development. Please note, my dear learners, when you are looking into organization, you might be a working individual. Then you look into your organization and see how the learning and development interventions are happening within the organization. Sometimes you might not be aware about what is exactly happening with respect to learning and development. Sometimes you might be aware, but you might be least bothered. We have discussed on the resistance to change aspect. We have seen that where employees totally don't like to come out of the shell and get updated. So many a time what happens is that learning and development, it's just as a namesake, it ends up in paper. Maybe as part of some token arrangement, some of people might pick up learning and development, but as an organization, as a whole unit, many a time L&D interventions are not encouraged or not happening, and that severely affects the organization. That's all from today's session. See you with more updates with respect to knowledge and the knowledge management within the learning and development in this module in the next class. Till then, take care. Bye-bye.